A few years ago, when I was eating gluten-free and still am, I went out on a date with a gentleman on Match.com. We were at the restaurant, and I asked the waiter to ask the chef if this one food item had gluten in it. And the guy looked at me that I was out on a date with, and he said, "I'm sorry, but I just can't imagine myself in the long term with a woman who's got to go to restaurants and ask these questions all the time." Well, fast forward to the future, he ended up marrying a nutritionist. When he told her this story, she told him he was out of his mind, and she insisted that he invite me over for dinner. And it ended up being a gluten-free dinner after all. So what's all the fuss about gluten? What is it? Plants contain proteins called glutenins and gliadins, and in the wild, they're supposed to protect the plant from being eaten by insects and even animals. Why? Because these proteins are really hard to digest. We say that they're very resistant to proteolysis by the mammalian gut, which means that our intestinal tract has a bit of a rough time digesting these proteins. And that reminds me of one of my favorite movies, Steel Magnolias, where Olivia Dukakis says, "What separates us from the mammals is our ability to accessorize." Well, apparently what doesn't separate us from other mammals and some insects is our inability to really handle gluten and break it down very easily. When we consume pasta and bagels and bread, we get a lot of gluten, and when it goes into our gut, because we have a hard time breaking it down, there's some molecules of inflammation that are potentially formed, called cytokines, interleukin-6, and even a molecule called zonulin that can upregulate leaky gut syndrome. And people that have genetic glitches, like people prone to celiac, they make more of that. But the bottom line is we all have a little bit of an inflammatory reaction because the gut had this protective mechanism. The plant had this protective mechanism. But if you're real healthy and you're young and you don't have any issue, you can eat the gluten-containing food and not have any problem. But there's a continuum of adverse reactions. One, over time. Two, if you start getting older, because age really brings less ability to break these proteins down. Stress, if you're recovering from a surgery, a divorce, overwhelm in your life, etc., you can start having more and more adverse reactions. In fact, one study stored the blood of 3,500 Americans from 1974 and over time monitored antibody formation from these people periodically. And they saw that as people aged, they started having more and more of a reaction. You could monitor it in the blood to gliadins and glutenins. So you can have a little bit of a reaction with no health problem at all, and you don't need to avoid gluten. You can have a beginning of an intolerance where you'd probably have a little less intestinal symptoms, and the most common symptoms of not handling gluten well are gas, bloat, pain, a little bit of diarrhea or alternating diarrhea and constipation. In fact, one study that took a look at people with irritable bowel syndrome, they saw that even though they didn't test positive for an autoimmune reaction to celiac, when they did avoid gluten-containing foods after about 6 weeks, they got a lot better. Then you can have a true allergy to wheat, and then you can have an autoimmune response to wheat. So there's a continuum of which you can have a response. You can have issues with any of these levels of adverse reaction inside the gut, which is called intestinal issues, or you can have it extra-intestinally where you can get systemic symptoms, anything from headache, fatigue, joint pain. There's even correlations in the literature with very serious illness such as schizophrenia or even bone loss. Of course, that's at the end of autoimmune reactions to gluten. So it turns out that everybody has a little bit of an inflammatory response, but it doesn't bother everybody, and there's a gradation. You can up it a notch of your reaction to gluten. The biggest issue is that there's no perfect test of finding out if you are a candidate to start avoiding gluten-containing foods. There is the intestinal biopsy that's supposed to have been the hallmark to figure out whether you have an autoimmune reaction to gluten, but lo and behold, people who have normal biopsies and still go off gluten. For example, there's a case report of someone with lupus with a failing kidney, and she had a normal biopsy, but when she went completely off gluten, she completely went into remission and her kidney got healthier. So there is no perfect test except for strictly going off all gluten-containing foods and over a hunk of period of time, because it takes a long time for your intestinal tract to heal itself, to give it a time to see if you've improved. A healthy intestinal tract looks like a shag rug, and one that's been damaged by gluten looks like a tile floor. So it takes, once you avoid gluten, about anywhere from 3 to 6 months, and some rare people up to 2 years, to go from a tile floor back to a shag rug. So sometimes it takes a few months to see, 6 weeks if you feel better by avoiding gluten foods, and sometimes it takes a much longer period of time. That's why it's so important to work with a well-informed nutritionist. And if you do take glutens out of your diet, gluten-containing foods, you have to make sure that you're eating a well-rounded nutritional diet. Now, some people are very excited about the paleo diet, which also avoids most grains and glutens. And so we're wondering if some people just get improvement because grains contain highly fermentable sugars. And a lot of people don't handle highly fermentable sugars really well. And the paleo diet has people like Dr. Mercola says go off grains and beans and white potatoes, etc. There's all kinds of a variety of diets, but the biggest test is trying it, identifying an issue, avoiding it for a long enough period of time, and seeing if it is your kryptonite or your kaleonite, if the food is your friend or your foe. That's what's all the fuss about gluten.